Let me just firstly explain the term safety clutter. Safety clutter is an invented term that is deliberately intended to invoke things like the idea of decluttering your house, to provide a socially permissive environment to talk negatively about specific safety activities without talking negatively about safety. Because I think most employees are sort of in a bind that everyone cares about safety and everyone hates some of the things that they're told to do in the name of safety, but are unable to say so because saying so sounds like you don't care about safety. And so we wanted to introduce some language that lets you say, I care about the patient, but I don't believe the checklist is helping me care, so that we differentiate the care for the patient with the belief in the efficacy of the checklist. So the environment in which we started to both sort of collect examples of clutter and talk about clutter was mainly in things like construction. And they have some practices that may be a little bit unfamiliar to healthcare. So just to explain some of these sorts of things, when you go onto a construction site, you encounter someone who briefs you about the hazards. And often before you're even allowed to go, you had to sit down and watch a PowerPoint presentation that they call an induction. It's a sort of controlled work site in the way that a hospital is not, that just you even going onto it, you have to have previously been approved through going through an induction. And then to enter onto the site, you need to fill out paperwork. And so it's very easy to see when this starts becoming duplicative. When you get asked to do the same induction twice, it becomes fairly obvious that something a bit weird is going on. The result is someone needs to do 5 inductions to go onto site. Like literally 5 hours worth of training. And it's entirely duplicative. Each training covers the exact same things. That's an extreme example, but it highlights the way in which safety systems interacting with each other can very quickly create work that is very obviously not serving some purpose in the prevention of accidents. The first induction, you could argue, you need to do. The second one, no one is learning anything. You could maybe justify it in reinforcement. But by the time you've done it again and again and again, you realize that you're doing it because the process says you have to do it, not because there is any rational purpose being served. Now, every organization has things like that. Things that have crept in that we know are not serving their ostensive purpose, but that we have to do them anyway because we can't get rid of them. Duplication is the most obvious example, but other forms it might take are excessive generalization. So where there are items on a list that have no applicability to the current patient or the current situation, it's just that they're standard on the form for every person. Patients encounter this every time you go to, say, a new GP where you have to fill out a list of like existing conditions, and most of them are irrelevant to your reason for going to the doctor that particular day. And all of them are already on your electronic record that's being held somewhere else. So you see that sort of excessive generalization creeping in. Things can also become sort of divorced from their original purpose. We can find ourselves being far more concerned with, do we have the client's signature on the informed consent paperwork than does the patient actually understand what's about to happen? The ultimate sort of just test here is this thing serving a purpose which is sort of evidenced, which is agreed to by the people being asked to perform the work, and where there is a sort of consistency in that belief and strength of belief across multiple people? Or is this being done because one person believes in it and is forcing it on to other people? Or is it that no one believes in it, but no one can work out how do we get rid of this thing? I think you're hitting on the sort of underlying engine that drives clutter. there's this asymmetry between putting things in and taking things out. And the asymmetry occurs very obviously in terms of opportunity. So there are lots of organisational opportunities to add things in. No one ever does an accident investigation and at the end of it says, we think this accident happened because we're doing too much safety. Our recommendations are to get rid of some of our safety controls. Your accidents are a prime example of opportunity to add something in. Audits, whether they're external or internal, or audit-like processes, are another one. No one ever does an audit and says, I've ticked too many boxes in order to comply. You're going to have to remove some of your existing documentation. Audits are like engines directly designed to say there are things missing, you need to add in a couple of pages, you need to add in a couple of sentences, you need to add in a document. That sort of asymmetry also exists in terms of pressure. So healthcare likes to think of itself as a very evidence-based environment. But our standards of evidence are weirdly mixed. The standard of evidence required to introduce a new safety control, unless it falls into really quite discrete categories of like medical interventions, the evidence standard is really, really low. But healthcare people are highly trained to think about evidence. So you want to get rid of something that is done in the name of safety. People want to look at where is the Cochrane review that shows that this thing doesn't work. And it doesn't exist because a lot of these things are really, really hard to evaluate. So once they're in, the standard of evidence required to remove them is much higher. The psychological difficulty is also much higher because we feel like when we add something in, we feel like, oh, that's got to be making things safer. And we feel like when we take something out, at best it's going to be neutral, but there's a risk it's making things less safe. So out of an abundance of caution, let's leave it in. And we don't tend to think that, adding things in, if they're powerful enough to improve safety, they're powerful enough to hurt safety. That balance should be the same, that our default assumption should be anything we introduce in the name of safety could be bad for safety. I would caution against trying to get rid of clutter because it is a futile attempt once you understand what is creating the clutter in the first place. Let me call it a very, very specific healthcare example. One of the types of clutter that health experiences is too many people just wanting to do research into healthcare operations that creates extra work for all of the people trying to get the job done in healthcare. And so their clutter intervention strategy is the creation of very, very complex and multi-layered approval processes in order to do any sort of operations examination. You need to get both ethics approval and site-specific ethics approval and site-specific approval and estimates of the resources you're going to take up and how those resources are being taken up and a sponsorship from the appropriate people. And you would need to do all of that if you were trying to do a trial to get rid of clutter either. This is a very common pattern, is that attempts to reduce clutter create clutter. This is a phenomenon that many people would have encountered is we try to reduce the size of forms, so now we create extra procedures necessary to evaluate the length of our forms, the time taken to fill out our forms. We've immediately created new clutter again. So addressing clutter has to be done by understanding and working with the mechanisms. At the moment, there are always more opportunities to put things in than to take things out. And that will remain. So trying to add in extra opportunities to take things out by decluttering isn't going to solve it at the root of there are more opportunities to put things in. But what we can tinker with is at the moment it is easier to put things in than to take things out. And so we reduce clutter by taking that same evidence-based approach that we use to fight against changes to safety, to fight against adding in things in the name of safety. So we can do that very easily with our investigations. investigations should not make recommendations. That's recipe for instant clutter. Recommendations should create hypotheses, and those hypotheses should be tested as rigorously as we test any other scientific hypothesis. Audits should not be allowed to put things in. The absence of something should be feedback to the auditor that you're asking the wrong question, and we should have a genuine fight about every audit non-compliance. The easy path should not be comply. The easy path should be non-comply and live with the non-compliance. And it should be up to the auditor to demonstrate why the thing that they're asking for is actually necessary and worth asking for. And the fact that it's on the checklist should not be sufficient justification for anyone. So if we fight back at that point, if we make it hard to add stuff in, that won't immediately get rid of clutter, but it will start to tip the needle on those core mechanisms that drive clutter. Once we've got that working, then maybe we can look at trying to actually deliberately strip out some of the stuff that we currently do that we know is not working.